John Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidt had better luck as a folklore hit. While John B. McLemore died, a motive for kids to get inside. A local village curiosity, a colorful version of Boo Radley, Alabama was no sweet home of this antique clockmaker into M&S. Instead, he focused on meddling into the lives and bodies of clocks and people. We're interested in his journey with clocks, precisely deciphering witness marks. Which brings us here, clock in tow, pendulum swinging to and fro. Fellow adventurers, Will and Drew, are here to unfold a history for you. Cracked by the passing of seconds pregnant, with moments filled or moments stagnant. Little did you know that memory persists when physical reflection of impact exists. This trail of dents and scars inflicted are telltale signs of a life depicted. The nature of wounds harshly dealt by hands of metal brutally felt against a dial once polished to shine, riddled with lashings from merciless time. Like a coroner examines a bruise, tracing the attack by taking cues, leading one all the way back to the when and why, courtesy of Robert Wren. There is more to the tick and to the talk than you may have originally thought. Relics residing in a yawn that's past have more to say the longer they last. So be wary of that old grandfather clock. He bears a good story we're about to unlock. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominique, for the introduction. As ever, very entertaining. My name is Dr. Andrew Hildreth. I'm moderator for this session. I think this is the only time I can remember where a panel has been comprised completely of liverymen of the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers. I'm a consultant to Christie's and Christie's Education. I write for a number of publications on watches and lifelong enthusiastic collector and writer on the subject. Before I start and introduce the two gentlemen to my left, I'll just simply state that the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers is actually the oldest horological institution in the world, started in 1631 by Royal Charter, and directly addresses its members to look at the art and mystery of clocks. And that's part of what we're going to be doing here today. To help on this journey, I have two gentlemen. The first one who's going to be doing the major lifting here, quite literally, I think, is Robert Wren. He started his lifelong passion for horology in 1975. He's working in his uncle's workshop, I believe.
That's right.
Correct. He did an apprenticeship, opened his own shop selling and restoring clocks. And after a while in that, in 1995, he moved to West Dean College, where he still teaches, I think, yes. He's later become a consultant to Christie's, the same place as myself, Bonhams, and the British Museum on restoring clocks and auction catalogues. Further left is Will Andrews, born and educated in England, but now resides in the United States. He worked under the guidance of George Daniels, for one, as a designer, and graduated from Kingston College of Art in 1972. Yeah? Okay. Indeed. He specializes in the field of time measurement for the past 4 decades. He's worked at Eton College, the Old Royal Observatory, Greenwich, Time Museum, and Harvard University, where he was the David P. Wheatfield curator of the collection of historical scientific instruments. He's written books and authored books on longitude and the quest for longitude, and was awarded the Harrison Medal by the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers in 2007. He also holds patents on longitude dials and sundials, I believe.
That's true.
So before we get into the actual clock restoration part, I'm going to address the S-Town reference as part of this. Now, S-Town started off as this request from a horologist in Alabama, a guy called Brian McLemore. And he suggested to this journalist to come and look at a guy who was claiming that he was getting away with murder. So the journalist duly turned up, recorded all the episodes, and sadly, at the end of this, McLemore committed suicide, cyanide poisoning at his own hand in 2015. That propelled S-Town, the podcast, to #1 on the podcast channels. So at one point, it had 80 million downloads. And because of the way this was put together, because of the way it was narrated, which was looking at the way clocks actually have witness marks, he started to tell the tale of this actual murder investigation. There was no murder, as it turns out. This murder investigation in the same way that you would analyze a clock and looking at the witness marks within a clock. So before I turn over to these two gentlemen, I believe the sound experts at the back can play you the opening paragraph so you can get some idea of where this was going. If you would, gentlemen.
Support for S-Town comes from Blue Apron. Chapter 1.
When an antique clock breaks, a clock that's been telling time for 200 or 300 years, fixing it can be a real puzzle. An old clock like that is handmade by someone. It might take away the time of a pendulum, with a spring, with a pulley system. It might have bells that are supposed to strike the hour, or a bird that's meant to pop out and cuckoo at you. There can be hundreds of tiny individual pieces, each of which needs to interact with others precisely. To make the job even trickier, you often can't tell what's been done to a clock over hundreds of years. Maybe there's damage that was never fixed, or fixed badly. Sometimes entire portions of the original clock were missing, but you can't know for sure because there were early diagrams of what the clock's supposed to look like. A clock that old doesn't come with a manual. So instead, the few people left in the world who know to do this kind of thing rely on what are often called witness marks to get it away. A witness mark could be a small dent, a hole that once held a screw. These are actual impressions and outlines and discolorations left inside the clock of pieces that might have once been there. They're clues to what was in the clockmaker's mind when they first created the thing. I'm told fixing an old clock can be maddening. You're constantly wondering if you've just spent hours going down a path that will likely take you nowhere, and all you've got are these vague witness marks, which might not even mean what you think they mean. So at every moment along the way, you have to decide if you're wasting your time or not. Anyway, I only learned about all this because years ago, an antique clock restorer contacted me, John B. McLemore, and asked me to help him sell a murder.
Good afternoon. Well, I was fortunate enough to know John B. McLemore. He used to ring up and we used to have long conversations on the phone. But I'm afraid today we won't be solving a murder. But what we are going to start off with is a little bit from an antique podcast, or as a novel as we used to call them, Sherlock Holmes, The Science of Deduction, by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So, Dr. Watson?
Holmes, I have here a watch which has recently come into my possession. Would you have the kindness to let me have an opinion upon the character or habits of the late owner?
Thank you. Sherlock Holmes balanced the watch in his hand, gazed hard at the dial, opened the back and examined the works, first with his naked eyes and then with a powerful lens. There's hardly any data, he remarked. The watch has been recently cleaned, which robs me of my most suggestive facts.
You are right. It was cleaned just before being sent to me.
My research has not been entirely barren. I should judge that the watch belonged to your elder brother, who inherited it from your father. The date of the watch is nearly 50 years back, and the initials HW are as old as the watch. Jewelry usually descends to the eldest son, and he is most likely have the same name as the father. Your father has, if I remember correctly, been dead many years. It has therefore been in the hands of your eldest brother. He was a man of untidy habits, very untidy and careless. He was left with good prospects, but he threw away his chances, lived for some time in poverty, with occasional short intervals of prosperity, and finally taken to drink, he died.
This is unworthy of you, Holmes. You have made inquiries into the history of my unhappy brother, and you now pretend to deduce this knowledge in some fanciful way?
When you observe the lower part of the watch case, you notice that it is not only that it's dented, but it is cut and marked all over from the habit of keeping coins or keys in the same pocket. Surely it is no great feat to assume that a man that treats a 50-guinea watch so cavalierly must be a careless man. Neither is it very far-fetched that a man who inherits one article of such value is pretty well provided for in other respects. It is very customary for pawnbrokers to scratch numbers upon the inside of the case. There are 4 such numbers visible, which suggest that your brother was at low water and that he had occasional bursts of prosperity, or he could not have redeemed the pledge. Finally, I ask you to look at the inner plate, which contains the keyhole. Look at the thousands of scratches around the winding hole. What sober man's key could have scored these grooves? But you will never see a drunkard's watch without them. Where is the mystery in all of this? Okay, back to the clock in hand. So we're now going to have a look at the clock and take some of it apart and try and solve its mysteries. And it is essential that you do not have preconceived ideas about a clock. You learn to read the subtle signs, and with experience, the clock will tell you its story. I should just explain what the clock does. Let's get my gloves on. It has 2 winding holes, and one of these is for the time, which is this one on this side. This is for the go inside the time. This one on this side is for the strike side, the hourly strike, and at the side we have a pull cord, which is to repeat the hours and quarters. And then we have a window for the date. The clock is by Henry Jones of London and dates from about 1700. There is a well-known Henry Jones, who was apprenticed to Benjamin Hill in 1654, and who was master of the Clockmakers' Company that Andrew was talking about. Henry Jones was fairly quickly turned over to Edward East, who is a very famous early maker, and was also master on 2 occasions. Henry Jones had 2 sons. One of these was also called Henry, who was apprenticed to his father. In 1695, Henry Jones died, and Henry Jones Jr. was free from his apprenticeship in 1698. He died in 1704. Like Sherlock Holmes, we are robbed of any data as the case has been restored, which would suggest that it has been through the hands of a dealer within the last 50 years. Firstly, all the gilding is very fresh and very bright, and it is of the electroplating type of gilding, not the rich mercurial gilding that John B. talks about in the podcast. The finials are very crude, they've got cast marks on and a modern thread on here, where they should have sort of a more looking like a wood screw. And they're not very well finished.
So just stop you there. Are you saying that these are modern and have been added?
Yeah, these are modern.
Since the clock was made?
They've certainly been replaced. The clock may not have had finials at all.
Right.
If it did, these have been replaced. They're later. They've probably got lost, or one's been lost, and so they've changed.
That one looks as if it has a little bit of a different finish to it than the other one.
They're all a bit different. They've still got their cast marks where they've come out of a mould,
Okay.
And
But they're all replaced, are they?
yeah, they're all replaced. The mounts to the top are repoussé, which is correct, but the threats to the side of the case, or sides of the door, are cast brass, and these are later, or replaced. They're very heavy and not very well finished. The wooden sound fret along the top here and to the sides are new and have new silks and modern glue in there. And then that's not uncommon. They're very delicate and they easily break, so it's not uncommon for those to be replaced. Opening the rear door, we see our first witness mark. At the top of the door, there is a slight burnishing where the bell has touched. And more importantly, this bottom rail is intact. I'll come back to that a little later. But the bottom of the seat board, I don't know if you can see that, is cut off, and it should come all the way to the back door. Now, this is possibly one of our first red herrings or blind alleys that we may go down. Before I take the movement out, I'm a little concerned. There doesn't appear to be anything holding this movement in this case. You would either have two turn screws in here behind the dial, or dog screws, very similar to what you would find holding a watch movement into its case. So they're like a half-headed screw that turns and locates. You would have, another method would be a bracket going with a screw or a stud this side going onto the plate. Or you would have
Bolts in the bottom.
two screws or two bolts going up through the top. And we don't appear to have those. So I'm now going to just take the movement out and see if we can see any witness marks for those. So I'm just going to put that over there for the second. And I'm just going to take, okay, we'll look for those witness marks first. So we have here, well, let's look at the witness marks of the holding. Here is a filled hole, which is a witness mark. We're not sure quite what for. And then we have another one here. You're more than welcome to come up at the end to have a closer look at these things. So there's two filled holes there, so we need to look into those. We can now clearly see that there are no plugged holes or drilled holes in the bottom of the case, so it's not had any fitting like this. There is, on this seat board, there's two little brass brackets, which are modern, but a few of these clocks are held into their cases with pins or two little wedges, as these two little brackets are alluding to at the moment. And that is the only way I can see that this clock was held in this case. But if we take the seat board out, we can see that is of modern manufacture, last 50 years. It's far too flat. It's been made, the wood's been planed by a machine, doesn't have any age, hasn't had years of oil dripping onto it. So that's replaced. That's a little bit worrying. But if you look inside the case, you can see the lovely colour and finish you'd expect to find inside this. And you can also see where the black comes down to the seat board. So what we can establish that this case had a seat board, was at this height. There's also two glue marks in the bottom of the case.
Can you turn it over a little bit more? There we go.
I don't know if you can see that, which they're witness marks to where these two blocks were sitting on. So we've spoke about, I was going to speak about that little hole on the side, the hole on the side that the repeat cord is coming through. That's very small, very tidy, and there's no wear marks on it, which is a little bit suspicious because you have to put quite a heavy, it's not like later clocks where it's a trip repeat. This is a pull repeat where you charge a spring up. So you put a fair amount of tug on that, and they usually have a hole with a wear mark going down where people over the years have been pulling it. Now, we're going to have a look at the movement.
Sorry, before we move on.
Yep.
So what are you deducing here? That this is a modern case that's
No,
been made for...
there's one other bit, sorry. We'll come back to that. I was going to point out, I don't know if this camera can show it, but there is restoration inside the top of the case with... do you want that one? Is it better?
Yeah, that's better.
So there's restoration in top of the case. There's some traces of modern glue in there, but that's quite what you expect to find. And if you can see how it's constructed, that's why you should never carry this type of clock just by its handle. There is also a cutout here for the where the bell hits, and that's again nicely burnished and of the right shape and right colour. So there's a lot of things that are tying this clock in, but it is an old case, but we need to confirm that the two belong together.
Right.
Which is always the problem with this type of clock. We have a look at the back plate, quickly for the back plate, because there is no witness marks to the back of this case indicating that it had brackets. So we want to confirm this on this plate. And there's no vacant holes anywhere up the sides of the plates, and more importantly, there's no plugged holes. So it was not held in with brackets at all. And then we can see the two pillars at the bottom, here and here. They do not have holes or tapped holes, so it's never been held in. So this movement's never been held into a case with two bolts. So they're two good things that make us look as though it holds into this case. And as I've already said, there was no dog screws on this dial. So that's good. I'm just going to take the bell off, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Let's have a look at the dial and the hands. And I like to start with the dial. And whilst we're like this, the minute hand looks good. It's the right length. It goes to the edge of the minute track. The hour hand looks a bit of a strange shape, but I don't make any decisions on hands until I've taken them off, because you need to see the back of the hand before you can make a decision. So if you bear with me while I take a few bits off. On reflection, looking at that hand, this central boss is actually quite large in diameter. It doesn't need to be that large for this clock. And if you look really closely, I'm not sure if this camera's going to pick it up, but yeah, there is a dovetailed joint at the base of this hand. Now, hands are never made in this way. They break quite often here, so that may be an old repair. And I think some of the restoration work that's been on this clock dates to the mid-18th century. and I'll come back to that again later. So part of that hand may be original, but possibly not all. They may have done a bigger central boss because the hand was then shorter. The hour hand, as I say, I don't overly like this end. The style is not quite the we'd expect to see for this period. And down the side here, you've got the witness mark of a join. So you've got a yellow-coloured brazed or hard-soldered joint. So the central boss may be original, but the other end is not original. But at least it does have its central boss. So that's the sort of hands. And also at the back of the hands need to look quite rough. They're usually they have a lot of heavy file marks on. But that is quite an old repair. Right, the dial. Let's take the dial off. So there we have the dial. Again, it is like the case. This has all been re-gilded and electroplated gilding. The chapter ring has been re-silvered, but this is a chemical process, not a plating process, and that's fine. But you've also got all of the gilding on the back of the case, back of the dial. Again, this should be mercurial gilding, like John B talks about, and you don't want to waste gold, so you had only gilded the parts of the dial that were visible. You would quite often see it coming onto the edge, only just, and sometimes just overlapping the edge, not fully gilded as this is. There are various scratch marks and date marks from repairers on the back of this dial when they've cleaned and oiled it. And they can be quite fun trying to decipher what's there and what they have to say.
Rob, the back of the dial plate isn't gilded.
Sorry?
I don't think the back is gilded, is it?
It is gilded, yeah.
It really is?
Yeah.
It's tarnished like that?
No, they're normally a lot more tarnished than that, to be honest.
Okay. All right.
And these scratch repair marks are very similar to what you'll still occasionally find today in modern wristwatches, where they either have a reference number in there or a date or initials of the repairer. We've also got, these are the runners for the date ring, and these are punch numbered. So you've got 3 there, and 2 there, and whatever there. But one of these is in the wrong order. I can't see what it is, but which one it is. Let's have those off. So there you have some numbered punch marks on there. That one's 1 and that's 2, so those 2 are in the wrong position. There's the date ring, exactly what you expect to see. And there's some quite flowery sort of flourishes to the numbers, which is very typical of Henry Jones. Now, one of the important things you need to look at is, because we're fortunate enough to be engraved on the back plate the name, and we've got Henry Jones, London here, but you always need to see the other side of this chapter ring. Before I take that off, I'm going to quickly whip off one of these spandrels. Spandrels quite often get changed and upgraded, but these, and then you sometimes will find the witness mark of a plugged hole or a vacant hole, but there's no such. But again, these have the mercurial gilding, but you can see that these are also scratch or file numbered. So on this one, you've got 2 witness marks there, scratch marks, and on this one, you've got 1 mark, and on the plates, you've got 1 mark and 2 marks. And it's not uncommon to find those all in the wrong positions. Right, going back to that chapter ring, let's take that off. And again, they wouldn't have wasted the gild in all around this section that's not seen. But we have here where it's engraved Henry Jones. So you want to look for witness marks here. And there are none. If this one was just by, I don't know, Robert Wren, and they wanted a more valuable name, they wanted a name like Henry Jones or Nib or Tompion or whatever, what they would do, they would hammer up from this side and file off the engraving and then engrave the more desirable name. But that we have none of those hammer marks there. There are various hammer marks, but that's part of its production. You'll usually see it in a line of where the name was. And on some clocks, you can even work out the name that was there. Certainly, if it's on a regulator and it screams to be one particular maker's name, you can sometimes follow those witness marks to work out what it was. So that's encouraging, not having any witness marks there. The one strange thing with this dial is we do have the witness marks of two plugged holes. This one here is the dial foot, so that's not a plugged hole. That one there is a plugged hole, and then there's another small one there. And you can see them on the back here with, and those holes have been done after this gilding because that bit where it's been filed hasn't got any gilding on. So I looked over at the movement, and we have a hole here with the cock holding on this verge escapement, and I wondered if those two lined up. And I'll show you a bit more of that when I got another bit further apart. But in fact, when they were on, the two holes do not line up. Oh, the other thing, that on this movement, there is the witness mark very similar to a taper pin, which made me think that somebody had moved this dial foot over, and they may have moved this dial foot over because of an escapement change. It's not uncommon for the escapements to be changed on these clocks. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But A, the holes don't line up, and we've also, this plugged hole has an engraved line on it, which is gilded, and if it moved over there, that engraved line would be in the wrong place. But more importantly, when you try and put this dial foot into this hole at the front, it doesn't fit, it's too big. So that was one of those blind alleys that John B was talking about, and it's not uncommon for you to go down and spend a bit of time working it out and realizing you were talking a lot of rubbish, really. So we're quite happy with the dial. We'll look at the back plate. That's just fallen off. That's the date wheel, but I'll just move that to one side. Now, the two things that jumped out to me straight away on seeing this clock is, firstly, this count wheel, and that is because it covers the engraving. It's signed on the back, Henry Jones in Ye Temple, which is a part of London. And you don't go to all that trouble to cover over your own name, then that's just crazy. But I quite liked this count wheel. It looks all correct. If I just quickly take it off. See, now you can see all the engraving. And the thing with this count wheel, I quite like this count wheel. The slots have been cut deeper, which is not an uncommon repair to find because they cut into the engraving. The backs have been stretched and you've got the witness marks of hammer marks there. Again, something not uncommon to find on a count wheel where things are altered. But what I don't like about that count wheel, other than it covering the signature, is that the engraving on it is quite crude and not done with any confidence, unlike the engraving on the back plate of the movement, which is, you know, really fine engraving. And my feeling is, well, one of the first things I thought was maybe this movement started off as a timepiece and didn't have any strike work at all, and the strike work was added later. But I'm quite happy with the sort of strike work here. And I think this had an internal count wheel. Hopefully that is proved when the plates are taken apart, but we're not going to do that today, I'm afraid. So that's an ongoing research, but that's my feeling for that. And as I said, there was two things I didn't like about this. The second was this pulley. This is the pulley that goes out through the side of the case, and you pull that and it winds up and it charges the repeating mechanism to strike the hour and the quarter at night or in poor light, both crucial things. But we probably don't see it in this light in here, but this is a different colour to the rest of the clock. Brass from this period is very yellow in colour. Modern brass, or relatively modern brass, is very pink in colour, has more copper. And this is very red. And then again, the engraving is very crude and doesn't match this engraving. Before we go there, I'm just going to take this out of the way because it's annoying me. This is what we call an apron, and its purpose is to hold the escapement in place. But again, this is a later piece, far too elaborate, and again, it's hiding engraving. You don't pay someone to do the engraving and then cover it over. So let's quickly whip that off.
Imagine throughout all the hundreds now of years, it was all compiled into one person. Do both of you want to take a guess at just how, like, Sherlock Holmes and the brother, he summed up the drunkard brother's life? Do you have your own suspicions about the entity, if they were to be compiled into one, who owned this clock in such a fashion?
Well, you might hazard a guess that the only murder that will take place is the perhaps unscrupulous dealer that re-put this clock together. I don't know. I'll leave it to Will and Rob to...
You would have to be wealthy to afford a clock like this. This wouldn't be afforded by the average person. It wouldn't have immense accuracy, maybe 5 to 10 minutes a week, do you think? Robert?
Yes, it would have been that sort of accuracy. The problem, if a verge, this clock has a verge escapement, it would have started life with a verge escapement. And when they were new, they would have been fairly accurate. And if we replace them or refinish them, we understand the escapements a lot more. Whereas a lot of the repairers along its journey have not understood the escapement, so they file and polish, and all the angles go wrong. But the advantage we have today, or the advantage that Henry Jones didn't have, we have far superior oils today. So they will go and keep good time for a longer period than it did when it was new. The verge escapement is quite hungry for oil, and it comes off. But more importantly, there's a lot more pollutants. There was a lot more pollutants in the air, and the oil would degrade a lot quicker and thicken a lot quicker. So that was what they were up against. Where today, if done correctly, we don't have so much of a problem.
And it'll actually cut a groove in the pallet.
Yeah. What happens? It's a brass wheel. It's the same for all clocks. They have a brass escape wheel. In this instance, it's a crown wheel, so it's going around light. And then a long case, it's a escape wheel. It's brass, and then you have hardened pallets for on the verge. But it's the hardened steel pallets that wear, not the brass teeth. And that's usually because the brass has got they've both got oil on it, but dirt and dust sort of attaches to the brass and it acts a bit like a lap, and that is what cuts the hardened steel. And so you end up, as Will was saying, you end up with quite heavy grooves, and then the easy way is to polish them out. But every time someone polishes those wear marks out, you're changing the angle of the escapement, which is not good.
Yeah. So they were sometimes pulled out. One of the first things that John Harrison did with his precision regulators was to get rid of oil. He realized in the 1720s, oil was really bad. Somehow, if you could eliminate oil, it would be much better. So by 1730, we know that there are existent clocks, one in the Clockmakers Company, which have lignum vitae bushings. And they wear very, very little. You have to keep opening them up because they tend to shrink when you first fit them. But his clocks would run 50 years without cleaning, so they were that good.
Is it harder to decipher witness marks, the more oil or less oil?
It depends what kind of evidence there is. I mean, a
wiping the
witness
body.
mark there, yeah, if the grooves, if you find a clock which is sort of old and very dirty and left untouched and it's got wear in the pallets, you would assume that it hasn't been touched for a very long time and that it wore itself down till it didn't work properly and the owner
Not much.
just left it not running, and then maybe they died and passed it on to somebody else. There was as the value of these clocks went up, particularly in the sort of 50s, 60s, and 70s, they became, the dealers would often do them up, sometimes change, as Robert mentioned, the name to make it more valuable, put Tompion on it. It wasn't uncommon. It's a terrible thing to say, but there was a lot of this kind of work. You want a Tompion clock? Oh, I've got a Tompion clock. So,
Okay.
by the way, I didn't diverge.
I'm now taking the pulley off. We can see rather than riveted on, that's got a soft solder joint. So again, confirms that it's new. And if we look to the front of the movement, we've got lots of witness marks and scratches. You can see all the marking out on the plates, how it was planned. We can see around here a larger witness mark where this would have had a larger barrel. And I think this, would, rather than being on the back, would have been on the front. And we've got 3 small tiny pinholes which go in and hold the cord or the string onto the pulley. So, and that would match up with the holes on the side of this case. Now it's got holes both sides. This type of system would normally just pull from this side, but you can carefully route another piece of cord across this and out that side, which someone may have done, but I suspect that would have been a little later. But most of this repeat work has been replaced. It all looks very modern. The shapes of the collets, that's the bits on these that hold the wheel onto the arbor, are the wrong style and wrong shape. We've got plugged holes on the front plate where bell stands would be. We've also got, there's a whole section there, a square section that is filled in, where that probably had 2 hammers there. And you normally have 2 hammers, so you have one that strikes the hour, so it tells you what hour it is, and then it goes ting ting for 1/4 and 2 for 1/2 and 3 for 1/4 2. So if you wake up in the night or in poor light, you can hear, you can tell by pulling the cord what the time is.
You've got to find the cord, though.
Well, that's very true.
I have to start to wonder how much of that is original then, given what you just said about the
Sorry,
repeating.
say again?
How much of the clock is original, given what you just said about the repeating mechanism?
Okay, I'll come to that in
Okay.
a sec. This steel work is, again, modern and just too elaborate. But we can confirm that it was quarter striking, because this is what we call the minute wheel. There's the witness marks of the holes and field holes where the cam for the quarters would have been. And as I say, it had one or two bell stands with two bells here, usually sort of like this and smaller. And I said I was going to come back to the bell. Now that is a lovely old bell, but it didn't start life on this. It's a bit too thick. And if you see from the center of it, it's actually been bushed to fit this bell stand. So that's not its original bell. I'm going to take off the back cock. Now, the great thing, we were talking about the seat board being cut, and about that being a blind alley I went down to. Quite often, what I should say about this pull repeat being replaced, it's sometimes replaced because it's been changed to a later escapement, a recoil anchor escapement. But other times it's just removed because it's become troublesome and the owner doesn't want to pay to have that part repaired. But you usually have witness marks here showing that this has been that it has had a recoil anchor escapement. So there'll be plugged holes. Usually this bit is cut larger and a different back cock has been applied. We've got none of those witness marks at all. So that's really good. But the reason why that seat board has been changed, that's possibly due to damage or loss. But the reason that it doesn't go all the way to the back is because I think they got the calculation for these pallets or for the train wrong, or just badly adjusted. And this pendulum, and the bob I think is original, just hangs below the plate, so that's why that cut. Now they are replacement, they're what we call book pallets, but they should have very much more simple. So going back to your question, how much is original?
Doesn't sound very much.
Well, the plates all are. Both plates, the pillars, the case I'm quite happy with, the setup wheels, the barrels, which are a lovely feature. They've got lips on the end, which is quite an early feature, not what you'd expect to see for this sort of period of clock. The fusees and possibly the centre wheel. Quite a bit of the strike train. In fact, most of the strike train I think is all original. One of them is a solid wheel, but I think they've applied a solid wheel because one of the crossings is broken. So it's the top half of the going train and all of the repeat work. Oh, there was one other witness mark I was just going to try and show you, and another little blind alley. I don't know if you can see that, but when I took that back cock off, there was a square shadow, which I was a bit concerned might be a filled hole. It is in fact where a repairer has put in a piece of paper or cardboard to adjust the back cock, to adjust the poorly set up escapement. Okay, so I think we'll move straight to the conclusion. We have a clock here that's had some poor restoration, but mainly all reversible. We've proved that it belongs to the case, and the clock is certainly by one of our respected early clockmaking families, Henry Jones in New Temple, London. It was a striking clock with pull quarter repeat on 2 bells, and importantly, the verge escapement has never been converted to a later escapement. Sherlock Holmes may have put this more flamboyantly, but with the aid of our knowledge and experience, this period of clock and the many witness marks and minor alterations, I think even John B. McLemore would conclude that we have a fairly honest clock that has survived over 300 years and could be easily returned with careful and sympathetic restoration, conservation, and documentation back to as the maker intended. Thank you.
I was just wondering, in terms of when you mentioned about the mercurial gilding, so how much, I'm presuming, mercury was used? You know, I mean, what percentage?
Oh, I don't know what percentage, but all of the gilding from this period of clock would have been mercurial gilding. The problem with mercurial gilding, it's very unhealthy for the person applying it. Like we have we talk about Mad as a Hatter, because they use mercury within that hat making process. So it's very hard to find people today to do good mercurial gilding. There are some people in France, but they're not easy to find. What a lot of people do is they have electroplated gilding, but they mask it up so it looks like mercury gilding, and then do a lot of hand burnish into it afterwards. So it looks the same, but you know, of course it's not. But having with electroplating gilding, yep, the very simplest view, you put it in a tank, you switch it on, you hook it up, you switch it on, and it's sort of done. Which is what John B was doing in the podcast, not mercurial gilding, but that's another story.
How much of the alteration to this clock has been as a result of expediency, and how much as a result to deceive?
I don't think any of this has been done to deceive, because it's just not good enough. There's not been much attempt. I think it's someone's attempt, and some people attempt this, and some people would put their own pull. I've seen fairly good clocks where you have the witness markers of all the holes where the original train went, but they've not followed theirs. They've got their one system for putting pull repeat, and they drill new holes and put them in. So I think someone's tried, but they've missed. They've not seen enough of these clocks or fully understood enough of these clocks. And we're still learning a lot about these. I mean, there was several good articles in the Antiquarian Horological Society back in, Stuart Kelly wrote, back in 2002 up to 2005. He'd done a lot of research on Henry Jones, on the family and some of the clocks. And even that, there's not, finding original, unaltered articles is quite hard. They've all sort of suffered over the years, but it's it's relatively easy on this one to see what's gone on for someone who for the lot of people that are around that know how to look at these.
It was financially worthwhile to do it, because if you get a clock like this in your shop, if it's unrestored, no one's going to buy it. So it would pay the dealer or the person who had it.
Yeah, there was a lot of work done like this 30, 50 years ago, which was quite acceptable, because the customer went home with a Henry Jones clock with verge escapement and pull repeat, and they were really happy.
And it was a good name.
And then some idiot comes along, like me, comes along and says, well, that's replaced, and they don't always want to hear that, I'm afraid. But it doesn't, I found, it does have a slight impact in the value. Because everybody wants to buy something that's very original, but everyone buying this period of clock knows they're going to be buying some restoration, otherwise they're being very naive. And I've always advised people to buy the most original, but I know whilst at Christie's we had a Tompion that had a lot more of this missing. The owner had bought that and some other Tompions, and then he paid someone good to put it all back. And so it's been through the rooms, it's all been documented. But when he came to sell those, sort of 30 years later, he actually saw the biggest markup on that clock, which goes against every guy's sort of say, to be honest, so who knows?
So sorry, just to backtrack there, you're saying that because it was all documented?
Well, it was honest, but I don't think it being documented. What I'm saying, it wasn't as though someone thought they were buying, a very original clock with all its, everything's there, everything's original. It's very easy, and in fact, in the catalogue, it said about the restoration and reference to when it last hit the market, when they sold it. So the paper trail was there and very visible, but more importantly, it didn't have a commercial impact on it.
No, that is important.
Yeah.
They're starting to see that in the watch market now.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Right.
So my first question, John B. McLemore, my real question, if he was alive today, what would you want to tell him? Each of you. In private.
Leave that town.
Yeah.
He wasn't very happy there.
He was
You
not
tell him that
happy.
in private, in secret.
He was sort of trapped in his own situation, and
Uh-huh.
I mean,
Why do you think he committed suicide?
he was. That's a very complicated question, but I think he was miserable. Anyway, if you hear the whole podcast, you realize there were a lot of other things going on in his life. You know, he covered himself in tattoos towards the end of his life just to sort of get closer and pay the young man. I think he had a sort of preference for men, and to be closer to this person, he visited that tattoo parlor and helped to pay this man, and it was a very complicated.
Not too sure it's connected to clocks, although, I mean, there is history of individuals working on clocks. George Margetts ended his days in St. Luke's Lunatic Asylum in London, having worked on astronomic clocks for the Board of Longitude and the East India Company. So, I mean, there is a sort of, you can bring association between clocks and madness and therefore the willingness to take cyanide. But I think there were other issues in his life.
That was the next thing I was gonna say, that is there like a correlation between clockmakers and cuckoo-ness?
No, I don't
Sincerely
think so.
hope
No
There is a
pun
phrase we
intended.
have called the horological virus, which people involved in this field get so passionate about it. It takes someone outside the field to notice, you know, that they're rather unusual. But you know, I've only known one person actually who escaped the horological virus, and that was Seth Atwood, who built the Time Museum. He gave up his interest basically in horology. He'd been one of the greatest collectors in the world. He still loved to talk about it, but to give up his whole collection was a major, major thing, and shocked us all.
I think by the time he was, he got to the stage of the tattoos and then the committing the suicide, I don't think he was having much to do with the horology then. He sort of fizzled out and out. He used to ring us up at Derek Roberts Antiques quite regularly, and I'd be on the phone for him for about half an hour. And then we'd have great technical conversations, and then he would get very negative, and everything was bad, and you couldn't earn money at this game, and everyone was rubbish. And then I used to sort of pass him over to somebody else, to be honest. But he was in correspondence very heavily with my colleague, who's on the podcast, and he basically went out and bought all the tools you could for this craft and to do the work. And he did do some substantial work. I don't know to what quality, because I never saw any evidence of his work. I've seen some of the photographs, but towards the end, he was selling off a lot of his tools. So it was almost like he'd done clockmaking and was then moving on to something else. I don't know, really.
The other sad part, of course, is he's become far more famous in death
Yes.
than he ever did in life. And now, of course, the family are arguing over who has legal rights. So.
Yeah. Let's see how that plays out. Any other questions?
Just minor question. You said about the bell was a bit too thick.
Yeah.
What should the thickness be?
Yeah, that's a very
on
good
that?
question. Not as thick as that. This is, I mean, if you come up later, you'll see it's very heavy. It's a great bell. It's a lovely old bell, but A, it's too heavy for this bell stand, and I suppose it should be 2/3 of the thickness of that. And more importantly, the hole in the center is too big. And so someone's put a piece of wood in there to bring it. Normally for this period of clock, you have, later clocks have just a post, then a tapped section for the bell to go on and the nut to go down, and you can spin the bell round. This early period of clock, they had that bottom part of the post had like a V or beak section, and then you had the thread, and then in the hole in here would be quite small with a little triangle bit to it. So it would go on and locate in one position only, and then the nut would go down. But great bell, just not this clock, unfortunately. I mean, someone's thought they've been very clever and lucky to get this bell for this clock. Bells fall off, bells crack, repairers break them, because they won't bounce.
Well, thank you all very much. And let's just thank the two gentlemen here. Thank you, gentlemen.